That's right. And we had all day yesterday, and we're going to have up until 5 o'clock today.
I'm so glad.
And yeah,
Okay, you ready, Dr. Vivian?
we really want all day, but we can't get it. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about your early work with the sit-in movement?
Yeah, in fact, actually, my earliest was 9 years before Montgomery, all right, is the Jim Farmer had started in Chicago. I was in Peoria, Illinois, and it wasn't long, well, it took a year or so, right, but that we were able to find out and put together a team of people in Peoria. Actually, it was students at Bradley University, of which I was not one, right, that really put the team together out of a church that was a part of the group that Jim Farmer, that had backed Jim Farmer in Chicago, right, the denomination. And they then began to look around these students. And I and a friend of ours, whose name does not come to me at the moment, who later became president of a couple of colleges, we joined right in, and we were close friends anyway. Ben Alexander was his name, right, from Cincinnati. And we all got together and began to work on segregation and lunch counters in Peoria, Illinois. Jim Farmer was in Chicago, dealt with lunch counters first in the Loop. We went downtown, did the same thing, and used tactics and ideas, not only from Jim, but that we made up and which we'd heard about, and et cetera, right? And we used them, and it was effective, so that we opened the lunch counters and restaurants in Peoria, Illinois, almost 10 years before Montgomery.
So why were you compelled to do that when it wasn't on a national scene already?
Well, let's add it. The other thing is because for everybody was looking for, remember, every African American in the nation, right? You did not have to be a genius, right, to want to be free, right? And you were insulted every day by what you could not do in America. I mean, it was an insult to live where you could not do things, and the feelings that you had were daily feelings, but you had to smother them, and you smothered them in all kinds of ways so that you could really survive, so that you could really exist at some level. Our humor, in fact, was humor that helped us live with it, right? If you were at the lower end of the scale, it was most likely to be liquor, all right? And one has to understand the habits of people in relationship to the forces that impinge upon their lives. And what always bothers me is the very moral people at church that talk about those immoral people in the street. And they do not understand that their institution is one of those that helps keep them there, when it was meant to be one that was to free them. And many of those who know psychology still did not understand the psychological disadvantages and what they do to contort people's lives, and how that those that considered themselves above actually blame the victim. And that's their way of feeling good about themselves, which is so very artificial and so unlike anything that a student of morality and spirituality would condemn.
You were very assertive about putting morals to people in the streets. If they were doing something wrong, you always tried to appeal to their morals, I guess. to try
Well,
to get them to see the
no,
right way.
you appeal to the nature of the society that put them there and kept them there. All right. How do you see? Public policy decides most of life. You eventually, as citizens, say, well, that's a normal way of living, and our culture is so much better than others. But is it? Or is it just that your public policy served the interest of others in a way that you just fit into it? Right? It is so interesting that here our concepts of trade robs a good deal of the nation, to use a quick word, of the world, right? As did the British. And when those people fought back, all Western culture at first said, they're so ungrateful. Ungrateful? But now they're in charge of their own lives, have their own materials. It took about 40 years for India to come into its own as a result of Britain colonialism. It's interesting. I talk with college students, and I ask them, do you know what colonialism is? And they don't know what colonialism is. And these are college students, right? I have whole rooms of them, whole auditoriums. And maybe 2 or 3 people have an idea. Right? But even then, they don't have a clear attitude about it from a moral and spiritual frame. Right? Is that because they're part of the culture that robs. you understand? Yes. So they've never been taught about colonialism in the first place. And those who have some idea have no attitude toward it.
What do you think that does to people of my generation not knowing those things?
It leaves you passive. And not knowing, you're passive then about things that you should be very clear and upset about. And if you even are not upset, at least you can be with the Klansmen and say you've got a right to do it because you're a white man. You understand what I'm saying? Is that the point being is that or you can be like the conservatives. Why, we have a right to all of this because after all, didn't we invent the gun and other things that cause us to be in control? Why is it that war is the extension of foreign policy in America? And not only in America, but of all of Europe, right? Is that war is the extension of foreign policy. That's why we have such a hard time getting rid of it. And yet Martin says that we must get rid of the triple evils, right? Of poverty, war, right? And racism. But he says you cannot get rid of one without getting rid of the others. Because war takes up all the materials and wealth that should be used to take care of poverty, to end it, to allow everybody in the world, not just in the United States, everybody in the world to have a good chance of living. And it would be so cheap, right? But we don't want to pay that because they're a part of our being wealthy.
So why is
meaning that their poverty is a part of our being wealthy.
Yes. So do you think that it's deliberate that they?
Oh yes, it's deliberate. It's a part of public policy.
So,
they voted it. Is that if they can vote it, just like slavery was a part of public policy, right? Is that if they voted it, yes, it was deliberate, right? Mm-hmm. And if they wanted it so badly that they were willing to go to war and kill each other over it, yes, it was deliberate. It could not help but be. These things are major factors in the life of humanity. They're very deliberate.
So what can you do to combat those?
Very simply, is to get rid of greed, or at least lower the greed, the materialism, and change the attitudes that make people think that they have a right to control other people's lives.
How do you do that?
Oh, easily, by education. Isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting? They have an education system that doesn't teach you colonialism, for instance. We live in a country that racism is a decider of a good deal of everything we do in one form or the other, but there are no courses in racism. Why is that? Huh? But let's go a step further. You don't have any courses in capitalism either. If you weren't in economics, you have no course in capitalism. Why not? Why, since it's our way of life, it would seem like that we would desire that every citizen understood capitalism and what it does and how and how we use it.
Yet
It's not there. And why? Because, of course, that's a part of the old. And we're still hanging on to it. The world knows better. See, we always want to know, why does the world do this and do that? Why do all those people, why do they hate us? Why do they react to us, right? And it's always strange is that we never hear them. We see them on TV, but somebody else is saying what they are supposed to have said. Because then we can pick out little pieces, right? And so we're giving the news.
that's very true. You just, by saying that, you just reminded me of what she taught me about the Bible. When African Americans were trying to read the Bible, you know, they didn't want people to read it on their own. They'd pick and choose parts to preach to them so that they didn't know the
Precisely. And they would not even allow you to have a black minister for years and years and years, right? Because they had a stooge to stand there and not talk about what Christ thought, though they were Christians, right? Because the poison that was in the pellet was white privilege and white racism.
So it's really about control.
That's exactly what it's about. And what was that word you used before? Yes, it was. It was a part of the way they thought and lived and dreamed and figured that they were the ones that had the right to do that to other people, right? At the same time going to church, at the same time talking about democracy. At the same time saying that capitalism is for everyone.
Can you tell us about the prototype that you developed that eventually led to Upward Bound?
Yeah, is that, let me give you an idea. Is the, someone had said, well, we were having with staff, we all sit around and talk with each other. And Hosea Williams said that in Savannah, Georgia, he had a class, after school class, to teach chemistry, because he was a chemist, that taught students who wanted to come chemistry, and that he got it into the schools, not as a part of the regular curriculum, because the school board, white, would not allow it, right? Well, what he came to find is that the reason that the chemistry was not allowed in its full flavor, is because then black students would be able to compete with white students on state exams that had to do with jobs as well as scholarships. Understand what I'm saying? Was it deliberate? Yes. Okay. Is that so? What he did was to come in after after his regular work hours and teach, and it was in line with something that I had wanted for several years, and that was after school classes. See, I'd wanted that for years and years before we started doing it. All right, because I could see in Chicago, look at the high-rise buildings, and you could have a class in each one of those buildings, right? You could have night classes in each one of those buildings, and the mothers would be more than helpful to you. And I try to put together an organization of mothers, preachers, and teachers, right? See, because a lot of the teachers knew but couldn't do anything about it, right? Is it that they weren't getting anywhere, right? But that didn't work out just because of the way I did it, I suppose. You know, I always blame myself when stuff doesn't go right. If the idea is good and it didn't work, hey, don't blame others, blame yourself, okay? But the point being is that when you looked at these kinds of things, you understood things were possible. But that's what started me thinking what Jose had said, what I had been wanting to do, right? And then as I was thinking about it, right after Selma, I was invited to be a speaker in St. Louis to give a speech for a group of nuns and priests that had come to Selma and that I was in charge of. I was in charge of clergy. So, so that's why they asked me, because I had, they knew me. And so I went in and I gave a speech, and they said, "Oh, this is wonderful, this is wonderful." They clapped and so forth. Right? And then they said, "What do we do now?" And then the grin went off of my face, and again, but you see, you learn if you've got that much power in front of you, right? And people that have already proven themselves as well, and have got that much background, and they ask you what to do, and you can't answer, and then you must live in a perfect world. And that obviously was not true, right? And so, thinking about these other thoughts, the first time I had said it all to myself, I hadn't even said it all to myself until then, and I started talking and laid it out, and just one idea followed the other one because it was a logical sequence, right? And they said, "Let's do it," and that's it. All right, I was saved because I couldn't say to them, and so there it was. And the point being is that you always should be thinking about some major thing to do to solve a problem, because it all comes down to solving a problem, right? What's the problem in the society? How are you coming forth with something to solve it, right? Not that you may have the perfect answer, but if you're thinking in that direction, others may join you, and what was the seed may become the tree, you see. And this is what it's all about. And they said, "Let's do it." They set up an office and started collecting money and everything to make it work. And before you know it, we had an office in Evanston, Illinois, at the university. We had everything we needed. But what I really wanted was students who could teach my students, right? So what we had to do is first, of course, to get these students. If you couldn't find people that wanted the program, it was not going to work. You could stand out under the trees or on the corner and talk about, you need this. But if they really needed it and the word got out, they'd come. Right? So one of the fellows that had been with us in movement was now he had his own a radio program, right? These were days when there was little TV, very little TV, right? And especially if you were poor, et cetera, and especially if you were in the backwoods, the whole of the South was the backwoods. We didn't think that, but everybody in the East and the West thought that, right? So the idea is that he got on his radio show and started telling students about the program. and they had to sign up and et cetera, right? Well, by the time we got underway, the other thing is that, so we started talking to the East Coast colleges. What college had people who could come and spend all year, all summer? I'll give you the difference, you see, and live off a stipend. You see what I mean? You had the wealthier schools could do that. There weren't any black colleges could do that. They had to work all summer to be able to get back into school at all, much less stay, right? In fact, we had students that had to work all summer with their parents to make certain their parents had enough food for the next year. You see, I mean, this was no, this is not because they wanted them to learn how to work, right? It's because they had to exist, right? That would have been a part of programs, and some that came but couldn't stay, right? So we were able to get students from the East Coast largely, right? But it was just right because what I wanted was students who had enthusiasm, right? That had a sense of the enjoyment of education. Right? But I wanted a black principal or a black teacher to be the principal for our group in each town. All right. It ended up far beyond what I thought. We ended up with about 16 different study centers across Alabama, from Huntsville to Mobile is the way I used to put it. Does that still sound good? I thought. I'm feeling good today. You can tell that, right? And we did it, but they were largely, the meeting places were largely in churches that gave us the space. See, these are the kind of details. But then we went to the University of Iowa, and they gave us all of the test materials that they had, because what I wanted to do was to test the students. Those that could pass college entrance exams, I did not want, right? They were already. But we ended up with a little over 1,000 kids that could not pass college entrance exams, right? Who had graduated from high school but couldn't pass college entrance exams. You see, what's left out? What wasn't taught well? What's this? What's that? We were making up the difference, all right? And we started with about 900 kids, and then we made it clear that this was not a what did I call it? Something on the lawn program. Give me a point. We're not out here for fun, we're out here to really do it. And we lost about 200 students, right? And, the very best thing that could happen, you see me, because they would have messed up it for everybody else, right? And so as a result, we had about 900 students. Before it left, 200 students had to drop out. So we ended up with a little over 702 kids, right? And then the good thing that happened, and I had not promised anything beyond preparing them. I had not promised them they could go because I didn't have any resources for that, right? And you got to understand that we never had money when we started a movement, but at the end of it, we would have money. So Martin paid for everything, all right? Government was supposed to, and I took it in and they okayed it. But government is so slow, right? And so Martin held up the program. I mean, held it up. The government would have held it up by not producing, but they were for it. It's just all the slow grind, right? And so they didn't really come forth with the money until halfway through the program. But we only had 10 weeks to do the whole thing in. I would have loved to have had a whole quarter, you see what I mean? But we only had 10 weeks to do the whole thing in and have them ready for September, by school in September. And I started looking for scholarships just in case. And Johnson was president, right? And he had the, what was the name of his program? I can't think of the name of his program. But he had, what did he call it? I can't think of it. But the point is that he had programs all over Washington. I mean, everywhere you look, there were
poverty?
no, the one right before that. He called the whole thing. He called
The Great Society.
The Great Society. See, I mean, it was the Great Society program, right? Is that and the Great Society program, the Great Society program was quite a program. And it had programs, all kinds of different programs, were all over Washington, right? He just followed Kennedy, that it set a whole different understanding of government, like Obama intends to do today, all right? A whole new understanding of government and what it could do and what it should do, and things were just alive everywhere. And I found these two guys up in an attic, what we would call an attic, in a building in Washington, right, that was giving out scholarships all over the country. And I went to them, laid out the program, right, for these 700. They just shifted stuff. And because they could call and say, how many scholarships you have left? Are you really going to use them? I'd like to shift them to, or can you accept students from, or et cetera. Now, I didn't want students to go to every college. For instance, we had a college, my example for this all the time is Minnesota. I can't think of the name of the school now, but it's an excellent, excellent school, largely for men. I have spoken there since. Very high standards, right? Well, the point being is, why burden a student with too high an entrance bar, right? Because it was too high for the average in the country, much less for those who had been without, who have to catch up. You see what I mean? And they didn't allow catching up. I mean, you know, you just, either you were or you weren't, right? Well, but the idea is, and it was also too cold when you've lived in nothing but warm weather. It's also too rich for those that never knew what money really was, right? So why have all of this going on in their minds when in fact you could use the average college, the average university, right? Or many that we don't consider average, but would be average in relationship to some who had extremely high standards. You see what I mean? And didn't have all these other disadvantages, right? And so we put them in school, and we started with 702. 702 or 3. We were able to put in college with scholarships. Yeah, it's now you know what? I only have, of all these award things you see, only one of them for that program. And to me, it's one of the highlights of everything, of things I've done, right? Is that, well, nobody went to jail and I didn't get beat. But then what happened, you have to see, though, is that last piece that's most important, is that government took it over when Martin and I left. Oh, but I didn't mention. Martin signed on with the Archbishop of the Catholic Archbishop of St. Louis, right? That's what kept the program going those first 5 weeks. See, it was the priests and nuns. They had the thing with the Archbishop. The Archbishop and of course Martin I had, right? And together they signed off on that thing. Can you imagine going into a government situation that just had Kennedy in charge, Catholic, and a Johnson that could sign off on the voting rights bill, and you walk in with that, into an administration that was still both Kennedy and Johnson. It's it's a pretty good chance you're going to get funded, and we were, and the program went, and it was a highly successful. Then the government took it over and called it Upward Bound.
That's amazing. This definitely helped plenty of people.
That's it. Well,
by doing that.
That's
I
right.
helped with Upward Bound.
There we go. In fact, let me tell you, a minister that followed at the church that Martin King had here, he came to this church 2 years ago, and we'd met and etc. So I went over to his office one day, and he said to me, he began to question me about Upward Bound, so I told him all about it. Well, he later told me right afterwards, he says, I heard you did, but I want to be certain. He says, because I went to Upward Bound. And he said, had it not been for you, I would have either been in jail or dead, because I would not have had the chance to go beyond high school. And the kids in the streets where I lived, that's what would have happened. And he came over and shook my head and thanked me. Those are the kind of victories that make you feel very, very good, because then you know, as Martin said, you know, that it's your life is not lived in vain.
Can you tell us about the Selma to Montgomery March and why it was so important?
Selma to Montgomery March, let's talk about its importance. That's the important thing, is that you have to begin to understand that we went to Selma, and why we went there, right? Then that fits in, right? See, we had come to the point now that the major thing that Martin desired and saw that we could have, right, was the voting rights bill, right? That's what would change everything in the country. In fact, he was correct. Johnson later called it the most important single piece of legislation in our time, right? But he knew, and Martin knew, you had to get there. It's a great idea. How do you get there, right? And in fact, Johnson, in so many words, told us, go make me do it. In other words, yeah, I think it's a good idea. I'd like to see it done. But I can't produce it by myself, right? Is that make me do it. And he wasn't, you see, make me do it sounds like, that wasn't that. It was the idea is legislation must be passed by people. That's what Obama's talking about, all right? If you leave it up to Washington, if you leave it up to party politics, if you leave it up to that stuff, right? It can't be done unless you find ways to go beyond that forces it to happen. And this is what everyone must see in the country, where they fit in making things happen. What do they really want? Anything they really want, they can have if they're willing to act on it and have leadership that is willing to push it. Right? Is the that's where we were, so that now we went to Selma to make it happen. A little backwoods place in a backwoods state and with backwoods people, really, right? Because right down the street from where our museum is now, it was a slave mart, right? So we're not talking about a nice liberal place where people might agree with you, right? And but we did go into a place that was not so large that things could get hid. Everything would be right out on the surface, right? And so we went there and started to open it up. We opened it up on the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, within 3 days of it, Martin had an Emancipation Proclamation speech that was too important to miss, so he had to come back And within 2 or 3 days, though, we had started our action in Selma, right? Now, I would like to say something to you there. You say, well, was his giving a speech somewhere more important than starting an action for that was going to open things up? You have to understand that everything we did was paid for in the beginning of every operation by Martin King. All of our salaries, everything, was always paid for by Martin's speeches. Without that, we could not have done. The average money coming into us was like $20, right? And people really never gave to you until they saw you had succeeded. It's an amazing thing. This is the marvelous thing about, I keep bringing up Obama, but I mean, the contrast and the similarities, right, is as well. He raised how many more millions than anybody had raised, right? Because now people begin to understand that if you give to things, you can in fact outgive the standard givers who have been controlling your lives because they could give and elect who they wanted to. What is it? The best politics money can buy. You get my point? And which was the standard, right? Who has enough money to play politics in this environment, where we have individuals who can put $10 million of their own money up to $20 million in case of one guy, and he lost, right? Now, what I'm getting at is we always lived off of what Martin gave. You got to understand that. Martin gave the speeches, money came in, boom. It went straight into the coffers of SCLC, not into Martin's pocket. And it didn't have to be that way. We tried to figure out one day, well, members of the board trying to figure a salary for Martin, and what should we pay this man? And they sat around and figured, what would he be paid if we were going by industry levels, if we were going by corporation levels? And said nobody was producing more of anything in the nation than Martin King, right? He was moving the entire nation. There was no way you could pay, right? But Martin wouldn't take it anyway. I mean, he wouldn't. No, we couldn't have paid him but he wouldn't take. He wouldn't take a lot of money anyway. Is because his line was, I do not, and he didn't. He never had a big car, right? None of that, and he lived in the ghetto, right? He wanted to make it very, very clear. And his salary was paid as an assistant pastor of his father's church, right? And that's what his family lived off of, right? Now, remember when he got the Nobel? He gave it to organizations of the civil rights movement, right? Is that when Martin died, Belafonte's had an insurance policy on him, was what his family had. See, I mean, we need to see that because Martin wanted to make certain that nobody could say that what he was doing for money, right? And that every time he walked out, he was figuring out if I could make $1 million. You see what I mean? He would never allowed that to happen. And he was willing to die for nothing so that he could do something worth dying for.
So that kind of idea of sacrifice, of putting yourself in harm's way for the good of all,
That's it.
Doesn't seem to have carried over to my generation.
Yeah, well, see, that's right. But your generation respects it highly. See, this is why, one of the reasons they love about Obama. Every black woman in this country was afraid that Obama was going to be shot, right? They said, we have brought up such a worthy and wonderful human being, all right? And some low-level Klansman is going to shoot him. Or worse, some organized group of the rich will see that he is killed and nobody even knows. As happened to Kennedy and his brother, and so many others that, or a few others, because very few have been in the position to. As I used to tell people, don't worry about your getting killed. You're not worth the killing to those who do the killing. I mean, most of it. Hey, see, to say, they're likely to kill me if I do that, is that, hey, you're bragging. They only they only kill the ones that it's rare. I had a guy who put a gun in my head, was going to shoot me, but he got saved from that by other means. But it's not because I was so great; it's because he was so bad. See, you know what I mean? Is that one has to read it as it is. You see what I mean? Yeah, that's right. If you're the one being shot, that's a whole different thing. Huh? But no, it is just true. I mean, it's just true. Is that the last thing they want to do to a real leader is kill him, right? Because then they're held with it, and it doesn't come off of people's conscience. The great thing about Jesus is that we killed the best man we had, right? Humanity did it, not Jews. Humanity did it, right? And of which they're a part. But it wasn't Jews that did it, right? Now, everybody was involved, and nobody can get it off their conscience, all right? Nobody can get it off their conscience. And so they have to think about him, and they know how good he was, because anybody that would love everybody has got to be pretty doggone good, right? It's hard to think about anything higher and better than that, right? But that's the point. Yeah, that's right. You'll never get your question finished if you don't stop and ask.
If Martin were alive today, what do you think his thoughts would be about where we are now?
Martin would say, we're in a wonderful position, because that's what he was. He was a realist. He understood, like he said, I will not get there, but you will get there, right?